Okay, I'm sitting here in the living room with Diana Copsey in Capitol Hill in Denver here. Beautiful home. Um, Diana, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you?
Well, I'm Diana Copsey. Uh, that was my name when I was born. I don't have a middle name, and I use my birth name, which is my father's name and his father's name. And that is pretty much how it goes, I guess, for most of us. Uh, I'm just told Arnie, I'm 80 years and 1 month old today, the 5th of July. I was born on the 5th of December, 1942, at the General Hospital in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, in Scottsbluff County. My growing up was almost exclusively on the homestead farm that my mother's father homesteaded in 1887 when he was 21 years old. And it's still in our family. I sold my interest to my brothers, but they're taking good care of the farm and the log house and the Grandpa Charlie Brackman built in about 1890, and the house that he built for his family in 1909 with poured concrete walls 14 inches thick. It's 5 bedrooms and the first indoor plumbing in any house outside of a town in the county at the time. Um, so interest in genealogy is one of the things that Arnie mentioned I could talk about. And a lot of my interest in genealogy began very early when I was looking on the East Coast when I actually lived in Maryland and Virginia for my Copsey ancestors who had come through Maryland in the very early 1700s. There aren't very many of us around, and we were always told that we were all related to the same John and Elizabeth Copsey who had been in St. Mary's, Maryland in the early 1700s. I have since found that there are other Copseys who spell their name the same way, Copsey, who immigrated to the United States in the mid-1800s. And they actually came in not through Maryland, but through New York and down to Wisconsin. And some of them ended up in Nebraska, where I was. But by the time they got to Nebraska, they were school teachers and physicians, which was more illustrious than most of the Copseys that I have found. There were 2 reasons that I really needed to go and look at what had happened with different families, and I'll start with the Copseys because that's what I've been talking about. But um, my grandfather Herman's mother died when he was 6 in childbirth with twins in 1900, and his father died just before his 12th birthday of sepsis from a wound that had occurred when he stepped on a nail while playing baseball at a 4th of July game a few years actually before he died. He'd been ill with that for a long time. So my grandfather was the youngest of that family, and he went to live with one of his mother's sisters and her husband and son and daughter, and he did not feel very welcome. One of the things he always said was that he was not even allowed to eat the same food that the family ate, that they bought his food and he had to eat the separate food. It was kind of a big thing for him. A few years ago, I went to Xenia, Ohio, the county seat of Greene County, where my grandfather had been born and raised in Spring Valley. And I got the probate record, which showed that my grandfather was absolutely telling the truth. He had inherited about $40 from the estate when his father died. The money that was left over after paying the debts and selling off the 17-acre farm was divided between the 3 surviving children. And his money was being used to buy his groceries and clothing from the mercantile owned by his uncle. So I guess families, taking care of families only goes so far. It does seem like if you have a 12-year-old kid who comes to live with you, you could at least feed them. But maybe times were tough. So when he was a pretty young kid, and he always said he was before he was 14, but he's still in the 1910 census with his aunt's family. He rode his bicycle down to the train station, leaned it against the wall, and bought a ticket for as far as the rest of his money would pay for. And Grandpa Herman Copsey got off the train in Surprise, Nebraska, which much to my surprise has more of a Wikipedia entry now than it did when I was first looking for it. There is a building that was built there for Chautauqua events and whatever. But he was taken under the wing of a older farmer and taught a few things. He was a pretty good carpenter, and he had some ideas about farming that were probably more appropriate for Ohio than for western Nebraska. If he ever saw a tree that wanted to grow, he wanted to cut it down. And if you've been to Ohio, you know you have no shortage of trees, and you do if you want to have land to put your crops on. You have to cut down a lot of trees. And that was what he remembered as a kid, having to clear the forest and burn the stumps and whatever. But in 1917, around the time he was being signed up to for the draft for the First World War, he had filed on a homestead claim in western Nebraska and was living there when he met my dad's mother, Vina, a very beautiful young lady who was living with her mother and 2 younger brothers and her stepfather. Grandma Nana Vina always told me that she had to get married because her stepfather would not let her go away for any further education. It was a school that only went to the 10th grade, and she had completed it. She could not go to dances, she could not play cards, and she could not have her friends in. So it was the only thing that was left was to get married. And they got married, and 11 months later had my dad on June 5th, 1918, their only child. So I always wanted to know more about the Copsey family. When I was in my last classes for the summer school of 1964, a woman in my sociology class came and asked me about my family and said she knew some people named Copsey, and I gave her my parents' address, and Mom had the information that woman had sent me, which was sort of the beginning of the link to these other much more well-educated and prosperous Copseys who'd come later. But Grandpa Herman would frequently say that when he was a kid, there had been some old folks who would sit around and they would complain about a group of Copsey families who had moved to Missouri and were never heard from again. That always seemed like an interesting thing to try to figure out. And once I was able to go onto the census records, I did find some Copsey families, spelled the way we do, C-O-P-S-E-Y, down in Missouri in 1840 and 1850. And one time they had one slave. always an interesting thing to find out about your predominantly northern family, which has made me wonder if they went to Missouri because Ohio was a free state and you could not have a slave in Ohio. I'm not something to investigate, Diana. When did Ohio ban slavery? I know that by the time of the Underground Railroad, if people could get across the Ohio River into Ohio, it was a free state. But they were there, same people, same Copsey families, interesting children's names. Charles Noble is always the one I remember. And he had several brothers. And I'm trying to find out, okay, what happens after 1850? And then I noticed that these three brothers that are with the family in Missouri in the 1850 census are in California in the El Dorado gold fields in the 1850 census. And at one particular time, interesting things that you learn at genealogy conferences, a fellow from the United Kingdom was with us, and he said, when we do the census on the years that end with 1, because that's really when the decade begins, not the 0 year, every household gets a card the day before and fills it out the day of the census and returns it. And it's always the same day every 10 years. Whereas in the United States, you have done it in January, you have done it in April, you have done, So I'm looking, and of course, in the early years in places like California Territory, people are riding around on horseback trying to get all of this recorded. Sometimes even one census taker's taking records over periods of days to maybe weeks. And the California records were 6 months difference. I think it was August to December. They had been in California in August and they were back in Missouri in December, or vice versa. Need to check that. But then I started looking at California free newspapers, and there were Copseys showing up all over. And then I found them in history books. They took the Copsey Herndon wagon train was the largest wagon train that had ever come into Lower Lake, California. And there's a Copsey landing and a Copsey settlement, and there was a copper mine, and they were doing all sorts of things. They were breeding draft animals and enslaving young Indians and getting shot and shooting people and
Wow.
having so many adventures that it's like, oh, maybe this is why they never rode home to Ohio.
So Diana, let me back you up a little
Yeah.
bit here. Why is genealogy? Why is it? I mean, you love it, right?
Yeah.
Why is it so important to you?
Well, it's the stories. It's those stories, like I was just telling you. It's not just the dates and the names, which are fascinating, of course, but it is better for me than like reading a mystery. And we watch a lot of mysteries. We're just rewatching Morse. After watching Endeavor, the prequel to Morse, we started watching Morse from season 1 the other night. And we've been watching Agatha Christie's Miss Marple.
Mysteries are really important.
It's the mystery.
Yeah.
But, if the mystery is in a book, they're going to try to tell you by the end of the book what happened. Genealogy, the mystery continues. Right now, what I am researching for, my friend Christy Wright has contracts to write an article for a New West magazine and one for Real West magazine, One will be on John Hoover, who was a saloon keeper in Park County, who got upset with a young man who was rerouting some flood water in the street of Fairplay, I believe, and kind of directing it more towards his saloon, and he got mad and just shot the kid dead. And the other one was for a kid who down in Alma, who was from Tennessee, who had been walking down the street with his friend, and the friend knocked Mr. Sims' hat off. Slyvester Cicero Sims is his name, and we call him Cicero. But Cicero took offense to that and shot his friend.
Wow.
So they were both in the jail together. Here's a story for you. When Judge Bowen, Thomas Bowen, who later became a senator from Colorado in 1883, and this was 1880. He was the judge for the 4th District down there. And he gave Hoover a jail sentence for murdering that kid. And it so enraged the populace that they broke into the jail, the Stone Jail in Fairplay, and grabbed Hoover and pulled him upstairs and hung him off the balcony of the 2nd floor.
Wow.
Lynched him. And they put a noose on the judge's bench so that when Bowen returned the next day to continue court, he and his wife and his clerk got in the carriage and fled.
Yeah.
They never adjourned the court. Sims was eventually brought into Denver and held for a while and taken back and was hanged legally, with.
So genealogy is just like the continuing drama of human drama.
Yeah, and so the other day I talked to Christy on Monday, and she said it would really be interesting if I could find some stories about Judge Bowen and Haw Tabor. Everybody knows about Haw Tabor. Well, I didn't remember this or know that. Both Tabor and Bowen were in running for that 1883 Senate spot. And there was a short-term Senate spot and a 6-year Senate spot. And Tabor was lavishing money all over. He has finally paid off Mrs. Tabor, and who was initially going to take a divorce settlement of $100,000 till she realized that Baby Doe was involved. And so she demanded $500,000, which is some big money in 1883.
Sure. Wow.
Which is probably why she did not die penniless like Baby Doe Tabor did. And so I was reading today, waiting for you instead of thinking about my own life. I thought, well, I will go on Genealogy Bank newspapers and see what I can find about just Tabor and Bowen and put the two names in together. And it was very clear that Tabor had been lavishing money, and lots of people were saying, okay, we'll vote for you, we'll vote for you. There were 27 Republican votes and 22 Democrat votes. So pretty sure the Republicans were going to be able to elect whoever was going to be the senator. And there were the 2 spots. There was a short-term one, which I think was about 4 months, and then the 6-year term. And the paper said that the agreement was that Bowen would throw all of his support to Tabor, and Tabor would get the 6-year
Diana,
post.
you know so much of this stuff. Where does all this information fit in your brain? It's amazing.
Well, it just to share this with somebody who's actually going to write it. I was going to show you a book that I'm very proud of, and I keep giving people copies of it, and would give you a copy if I can spy it around here. I do a lot of genealogy work for Christy Wright. I met her when I was first down in Park County getting the 215-page probate file for my Whole Foods grandparents who had a ranch at the base of Bria's Pass. And she actually writes books. She's written a book about crimes and criminals and murders in Park County that I've helped her with. She now has these 2 newspaper articles. She's collaborating with a widow of a guy named Charles Price, who may get back to working on the book Charles was working on about the Lake County War, which fascinates me.
And I want to get back to you and your life a little bit here.
Okay.
How did you end up here in Denver?
Well, in my first marriage, I had ended up going to the Washington, D.C. area where I worked for a number of years and put John through undergraduate and law school and was divorced. And I had met my son's dad there. And it was 1975, and we were both really fed up with Washington and politics and the Nixon administration and the Vietnam War. And Mac's parents were living on the North Fork of the John Day River in Grant County, Oregon. And we packed out and went up and lived with them in that summer and lived in a tent and built a cabin and really looked into trying to prove that the gold claims were worth the time of a prudent man to develop as a working claim. That area is now very rightly part of the Umatilla Grant County Umatilla Pendleton Wilderness area in Grant County, Oregon. This obviously was not going to work out. We did decide to get married there, and we did. We had a double wedding in Walla Walla with friends that we met there. And I had been freelancing for the company that I'd worked for since 1968. And I saw the editor at a meeting in San Francisco that I was covering. And I told him that I would like to come back as a full-time employee. And he said, well, you can go pretty much anywhere you want and be a bureau chief, but I don't have a spot for you in Washington. And I said, I don't want to go to Washington. So we had liked the mountains, and we had a rule, I was told. I needed to be able to get to a post office every day. We were still typing and mailing our copy.
And this is journalism?
Yeah. I needed to have a telephone. These are things I did not have. I was 35 miles from a town of 320 people when we were in the wilderness. And it was you got there and you could borrow a phone and you could mail something, but it was another 50 miles over Battle Mountain to the Pendleton Airport, and they only were supplied by United, and they were on strike that summer. We were really pretty.
You were out there.
We were out there. It was an adventure. I'm glad that I had it, but we started driving back on the 6th of January, and when we got into Kremling and other places, we would talk to them about how long does it take to get to the Denver airport, or what. And we got to Idaho Springs, and people told us that you can get to Stapleton Airport pretty much any time of the year in an hour. And they had, I think, already done the first bore of the Eisenhower Tunnel, of course, but we were east of that. But so we spent one night in a motel. I started going to city council meetings, and he got friendly with the people who ran the Clear Creek Current newspaper.
And Mac was your first husband?
No, I was divorced.
Oh, you were
before I met him.
Okay.
We married on 27 November of 1975 in Walla Walla, Mac and I. And we had both been married before. And we thought that marriage is what caused divorce. But his parents were not happy that we were not married. And it was, I guess, kind of an issue. The little town of Ukiah, they were putting together a calendar, like churches and other places do, which had people's birthdays and anniversaries on them. And you could pay $1 or something and put that on there. And so I put all of our birthdays on there, and then they kept wanting our anniversary. Well, I'm not going to make up a wedding anniversary when we haven't gotten married, but it was obvious, kind of, and people knew, I guess, that we were living in whatever we were living in. But we did get married out there. And I didn't even want to tell Anole because our relationship had become so strained. But Mac did tell them. And then he told me what they said, which was, you never should have married that woman because we can never forgive someone who forced our son to fornicate for 2 years.
Oh, silly.
I called my dad, kind of feeling badly about this, and he just roared. He said, oh my God, how did you do it? I wish I could find a woman who would force me to fornicate, which really helped. But that relationship was very strained. And Mac had had 9 years that he told me about, during which he had had totally severed relationships with his family. So us going out there was sort of an attempt to give us a different start and maybe be involved with them, but it really hadn't worked. I mean, looking back, there was any sensible person would have told you this is probably not going to work, and probably getting married just sort of at that point where you really say that you're going to leave probably won't work. But we did end up in Idaho Springs, and I did work, and he did find some fulfillment in his work with the Current, although not really much income, but we were doing okay with mine. And he was there to travel, and we had a girl with us who was, I will say, a foster. She turned 12 the week after my son Alex was born, on July 6th of 1978. He will be 45 tomorrow. So I did have this kind of marvelous thing happen where I had a child, which I was never sure would happen, and did not happen for a lot of the women that I knew and worked with in this field and for that company. Not many marriages made it, and a lot of the women just never found a way to have children. Or those who did, didn't stay in the career. I traveled with Alex, my son, for the first 2 years of his life. I never left him, and I would arrange to have people come with me, my mother, other friends, find some daycare. And I could never quite imagine doing that again with another child, or, leaving him or whatever. So around the time that Alex was born, Mac got a job as a photographer for the Golden Daily Transcript. But that didn't last very long.
Is that the paper in Idaho Springs?
No,
Golden.
Okay. And Idaho Springs, they continuously hoped that there would be more of a salary for him, but it didn't really work out. But he had wonderful experience, and he won statewide honors for different photojournalism and stories that he did.
Wow.
And he did some very interesting investigative reporting about the county commissioners up there and how they were putting contracts in to help their family corporations with the gravel for the roads and different things. Probably not surprising at all to anybody that that's how it works, but he's certain that one time when he was walking home he was shot at, so I don't know. Later he was killed, and we don't know, but that's another story. He was coming down to Denver up to 3 times a day, down to Denver from Idaho Springs in a little vehicle that made about 10 miles to the gallon, and trying to cover the state house and sell the coverage to different weeklies around the state and make a business out of it. And it was just really clear that this is probably not going to happen. If this is something you really want to do, let's go down to Denver. And so when my son was a year old in 1979, we bought a house at 1449 Downing. And a few years later, Lisa, the girl we were raising, had a mental breakdown that involved getting her into a hospital situation. And a few years after that, Mac was killed. So I moved here, just leaping ahead through the 80s, in October, November of 1987, after his murder at that house. Still unexplained, but that's a hard thing to go into. Betty Wigington was a realtor who had been at First Unitarian and gone to New York for a while and was just back. And Jim Hobart said, Betty, Diana needs a house. I was living with a friend in her basement and trying to figure out what to do with that house that I didn't feel I could ever live in. And Betty took me to lunch and talked to me about what I was foreseeing for my life raising my son, who was 9 when his dad was killed. And initially I thought I should be in either a far suburb, or if I wanted to keep him in school and keep myself involved at First Unitarian and with other things that I'd done, perhaps a very secure apartment building where you would drive in and it would take you up. But she took me to 5 houses one day, and this was the last one. And when I walked in, it just felt like this was home. And if you saw our house up on the farm, you would perhaps say, okay, I see where that happens, that porch and a few things like that. The owner was a couple. The wife, whose name was Diane, was pregnant, and her husband, Bill Lacey, had not been able to find work in Denver. The 80s were pretty depressed here. That recession went on longer, I think, because of shale oil. So he was already in California. He was a furniture builder. And she was pregnant, and they marked the house down considerably from what they had paid for it. So Betty would always say, you were the first person I knew who didn't try to get lower than the offered price at that time, but I knew they'd taken about 20,000 off of it, and it was almost 25,000 less than they paid. And I've stayed in communication with them. I've seen their little boy when they came back the next year, and their boy and girl, of course, have graduated. And so I feel like they really gave me a great gift. This house was in good shape when I moved into it. We've done a lot.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful place.
Well, it's very comfortable is what I'd like to say. You know, it's just, it gets very cluttered, but that's sort of what houses do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you live in them, right?
Yeah. I mean, I bought that thing and now it's got stuff stacked on it, and I have file cabinets, and I got to go see my tax guy, and I don't know where the stuff is. And last year we did an estate plan, and I don't know where the book is. But I think we've done pretty well.
Yeah, you have. You're married to Edwin right now, right?
Yeah. What do you know about Edwin? I went through the murder and the initial investigations. I was accompanied by police when I would go back in the house, and they would keep tracks of everything that I was taking out, and then it sort of quieted down. And about 6 months later, I went to a square dance at First Unitarian on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th of 1988. And I'm wearing black pants and a black sweater and my black boots, and I've got my 9-year-old kid and his little friend Arena from school. And the year before we had done a square dance, and there had been food, but they had not done that for whatever reason. So I had a pizza delivered or brought it or something. And then we did this square dance. And Edwin was there. And then Edwin was at church. And then Edwin was at volleyball, which we used to do every Sunday in the afternoon. And then Edwin was helping out in the kitchen for Mother's Day. And he was taking pictures. He was not playing volleyball, but he had his camera, and it was the same camera that my son's dad, Mac, had had. And I had a lot of camera stuff and darkroom stuff in the garages of the Downing Street house that at that time I was renting out. So I suggested that I could give him that if he'd like to. And he was renting an apartment at the Emily Dickinson on Poets Row on Logan. And so we'd come back to church, and we'd sit on the porch swing, which at that time was at the other end of the porch. And then he would say something like, well, I think I better go get some lunch. And I'd say, well, I can give you a ham sandwich and a cup of tea. He's very much a hamburger and coffee person, but it just sort of evolved from that. And we had Bibliogore's book club at the time, and part of that was that we would do a potluck that was themed with the book we read. And we were going to be at Zoe Sewell's, Joe and Zoe Sewell's that night. That I actually did this first kind of date with him. We did a picnic down at the park in Alamo Placida Park together one Saturday, and just walked over there with a picnic basket, and my little boy is going crazy and doing papa wheelies around us on the table. And then I told Ed that I needed to go to the Indian grocery and shop and do some cooking. And he said, can I come with you? And I said, well, I'm sure it's okay. And I called Zoe, and it was okay. And we went down to their home and took a walk on Highland Canal and whatever. And we came back and we were saying goodnight. And I kind of go in for that coffee hour hug. And he kissed me.
Oh, wow. Oh.
And then he just smiled at me and laughed. And I'm like, what? What just happened? It just had not occurred to me. Here's this lonely guy who's just moved here from Colorado Springs. He's a split shift, part-time bus driver at that time. He'd come to Denver because he couldn't really get employed down in Colorado Springs. It was just absolutely amazing to me. And right around that time, the police decided that they were really going to look at me as the person who set up my husband Mac's murder. And I got back in touch with the attorneys I talked to at the time of the murder in September 7th of 87. And they said, well, you absolutely can't date, you can't do this, you can't do that. You've got to, give us a retainer and, on and on and on. And I said, but I didn't do any of this. They wanted, and they did. They had started the year before interviewing all of our friends. The police also were interviewing everybody like Nan Wigington and Rob. And Edwin, at that point, he just wanted to immediately go to the courthouse and get married. So obviously he never thought that I killed Mac, but it was tough. And little Alex, we took him on a Memorial Day picnic with a friend up near Nederland. And he and Brian were off playing cowboys and Indians or whatever they were doing in the trees. And Edwin and I were just standing there, pretty, hugging. And Brian and Alex came down and he said, I need to talk to you, Mom. And I said, you can talk to us both. No, I need to just talk to you. So I went off with him and he said, Brian says that you and Ed were kissing. Tell me it wasn't true. I said, well, he might have seen us kiss. He said, well, promise me you'll never do that again. I said, I'm not sure. That's something I kind of want to promise. Well, promise not on the lips. I said, okay, we're going to go back to the child psychiatrist. We'll go back and see Ron Gallegos, who has helped us so much. We're going to see him. So while we're waiting for Ron, I said, what is it about me kissing Ed? And he said, well, if you kiss him on the lips, you'll get pregnant and you'll have the baby and you won't love me anymore.
Oh.
Okay. I'm glad you got that all figured out. So I gave him a little bit more than I probably should have given him about. And he said, you did that for me. Was it worth it? Just stop right there. And I said, well, sometimes people do it other than just to have a baby. So Ron comes out and says, you can come in now. And Alex says, no, we're fine. I've got it all figured out. He said, no, I think you need to come in. And Ron had Edwin come in and he said, what are your intentions in this relationship? And he said, well, I'm going to marry her. What is your timeline? Next week, next month, next year, whenever she'll say yes. So we were married to much surprise of many people who, because it was summer and at that time we did not do much at First Unitarian over the summer. We got married on the 17th of September. And that was 1988. And in 2012, when Alex had graduated from Arizona State and been hired at Ohio State. We were with him when he did the media design for Almost Normal at the Mixed Blood Theater in St. Paul. And as we were leaving, he said, "Ed, can I call you Dad?"
Wow.
So
he got over you guys kissing.
he lets us kiss. He is very glad to have us together for 35 plus years. And he is, of course, not over having witnessed his father stabbed 31 times. And that's what he was doing when we were in Ohio. The last week of May, we were there for 6 nights, and he was putting on his one-man performance that he did as his thesis when he graduated from Arizona State. It's called The Survivor's Way, and it has 6 scenes in investigating who his father was and his grandfather, his father's father, Ole, and the night of the murder plays a very big part in that, and the guilt that he felt that maybe he could have stopped that from happening because he was the first one to be aware that the intruder was in the house.
It's a lot for a young man to carry.
Oh, I had not realized how much we had seen this in Tempe, but it was shortened. He had 6 episodes for that. It's been very much changed, I think. But his daughter Loie, who will be 13 in end of November.
Your granddaughter.
My granddaughter, my beautiful, beautiful granddaughter. She was a year and a half old, and she had febrile seizures the week that he was putting on the show. So while we were driving down there, I got the call that Loie was in the hospital. And because of that, the first night of the show was not done, and the next 2 nights it was done in a more abbreviated fashion, which is what we saw once. I saw it 3 times in Ohio, and Alex has shared with me a video, just a raw footage video that was done. You can see the back of my head because I'm in the audience and it's very small. It was done in the motion capture lab. He wanted to show that it could be done even in like a garage setup. Lots and lots of media design and backlit projections and shadow theater. It's everything that he ever learned or devised. Alex is a dyslexic kid who didn't read till 3rd grade. Got a lot of help at the Denver Public Schools, and really blossomed after he went to Fort Lewis College in Durango.
Wow.
Graduated from there with honors, went to Arizona State on full scholarship with a loan package that hopefully will be forgiven because he's now over 10 years on the faculty at Ohio.
Wow.
So all that's a lot.
That's a lot, Diana. So you've seen a lot in your 80 years. I mean, technology's really changed. Politics have gotten really... You've seen a lot of crazy politics in 80 years, I'm sure, and they're still crazy. What do you see? What do you think about the world that you're living in now?
Part of the genealogy is knowing that there were Bart and Mary Taylor Greene and, Trump, I don't really understand what Biden's son might have done or didn't do. And when I see headlines that say that the Republicans are debating whether to impeach Biden, I get very crazy, distressed. But at 80, there isn't much I can do. At in my 20s, I was in the first a self-imposed or self-choice in a way. I can get myself too much solitude, but I don't do well in a lot of crowds. I mean, even church on Sunday. During the coffee hour, I ended up sort of going and propping myself on a stool by the greeter's table. I really realize that I am, at this point in my life, I don't want to do small talk. And maybe that's where genealogy gives me something, because these stories are so, to me, so interesting, and they tell so much about the people and about people in general, and the history. But I can bore people stupid telling them the genealogy of my own family or the people I'm researching. I researched, the book I did not find to show you is about the people who went to Canada during the Underground Railroad days, and then later there were people from the Carolinas who were wanted while we still had Reconstruction going, because they were wanted on capital murder charges following the Civil War. And they went up to Canada and were welcomed because they were wealthy plantation owners, and they integrated themselves to the highest levels of society up there in the same neighborhoods, or adjacent to where the former slaves had settled. And we were up there after we were in Ohio. We spent 4 days up in Canada with my friend Chip, who did that book. The next book that Chip is going to do is about Klondike Joe Boyle, who grew up with a horse racing magnate kind of father, and ended up going out on the gold strikes in Alaska to the Klondike and making a fortune, and in his early 40s signing himself up when he couldn't be actually enrolled in the Canadian Army. He had his own uniform made and went over to Europe and became a paramour, or do you call men a paramour? A lover of Queen Maria of Romania, and helped with all sorts of food relief and other things over there. And I've also helped Chip with baseball books and other things that he's done. I'm not too interested in baseball, but the people who are involved are fascinating. And I'm also investigating the burials in mausoleums at Fairmont Cemetery for my friend Christy.
Wow.
And when you get into those, you find out how come there's this mausoleum that was originally in about 1904. It was in the Jewish cemetery that was at the east end of Cheeseman Park, over across 8th into Cheeseman. And then the whole mausoleum was moved to Fairmont.
Yeah.
And his wife left a will that, I think when you read the whole will, maybe it couldn't be broken very well. But her brothers and sisters tried to break the will because she had left about $100,000 in this charitable foundation in her husband's name. They had no children. And so there were lawsuits, and they were trying to do it. And when you read the will, she says anybody who tries to say that they should get something should get $1 and no more. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up,
Wow.
but you find it. So it's much nicer than watching the news.
It is. What a great story.
Yeah.
So, finally, if you have a wish for your granddaughter, what would you wish for your granddaughter?
I asked her when she was up at the farm with us, and she was having a good time going out on the tractor with my brothers when they were baling hay in the big round hay balls they do, bales. said, "Do you think you would ever be a farm girl when you grow up?" And I was like, "No, I know what I'm going to be when I grow up." And I see for the future. I hope for all of the children of the world that there would be peace. The craziness of the war in Ukraine, the threats that seem very real with China. Watching 60 Minutes the other night, they had the people from the Navy talking about what they were doing to try to be sure they could defend Formosa. You know, part of me doesn't know why the United States has to be involved in all of this, or the millions and billions that are spent on different ships and that don't even ever fulfill their developing plans or something. I have a book that I really read way back when I was still working at the DuPont Circle building in Washington, D.C. when we first moved there, and I got the job in 1968, and it's called The Report from White Mountain, and it's supposedly talking about why the only way the economies of the world can work is to perpetually prepare for war with all of the money going into those things instead of into schools and food and homes and all of the things I think the money should go into. But we have such a huge part of that budget, which is we're not really told what that is, how much it is.
Right.
And people focus on what they don't want to go to, who they don't want it to go to. That's frustrating.
It is.
Other than, trying to be an educated voter, I don't think there's much that I can do at this point.
Well, you can wish peace for the young.
Let there be peace in the world, and let it start with me. And part of that, I guess, is to not spend a lot of time trying to even figure things out. The murder was never solved, and last year it was the 35th anniversary of that murder.
Wow.
In September, and shortly before then, I had seen a notice that the Academy for Lifelong Learning was having Mitch Morrissey, who was a former county attorney here in Denver, who has his own firm now doing very advanced DNA.
He was a district attorney.
Yeah, district attorney.
Yeah.
He did a book of all of the Denver district attorneys. Really nice book. I've given away 2 copies of it. I need to get one for myself. But part of reading that book is that it really goes into what were the different things that were going on in Denver at the time. You know, we had the Bunko Men, and we had the Ku Klux Klan, and we had quite a few other things at different times that were the focus of the silly girl of the district attorneys. I talked to him after his talk, and he gave me his card, and I emailed him, and he emailed me back. And he did actually go and check with the homicide detectives and found out what had been done with the DNA samples from the night of Mac's murder. And some of that had been retested, but he thought he could, at his company, test it if he could get a hold of it, and that if I would give a reward through Denver Crime Stoppers, that would, fund that. And he gave me a name, and I contacted that fellow. Mitch had mentioned amounts of $2,000 and $5,000, and I was willing to take that out of my reverse mortgage, instantly. And I got a hold of the fellow at Denver Crime Stoppers who emailed me that he would call me the next day or so for a short talk, and he never did. And then I poked both of them again a couple times, and
Nothing.
nothing. Just absolutely. It upset me so much that I did talk to Tom Arnold, is a retired attorney in his mid-80s who's in our core circle, and Tom came down and had lunch with us. And I talked to him, and he talked to somebody that he knew. You know, it's like nobody really knows what you can do. I've called over the years to the homicide people. I don't do this very often, but over 35 years, maybe 3 times. And I'll say, has anything been done on this cold case? I just noticed in the newspaper that this cold case from 82 or this cold case from 96 has been solved. And I'm wondering about Alexander Macklin Olszewski, who was killed on September 7th, 1987. And they always say, and why are you interested? Well, I'm the widow. Well, isn't there some question that you had a hand in setting that up?
Wow.
Not in my mind. Well, what can I do to get the case reopened? It's never made inactive, but how do I get this to be really actively investigated? One guy said, well, you'd have to come down and take a lie detector test. And I said, well, how do I make an appointment for that? And he said, I've got another call, and hung up on me.
Jeez.
So that's part of what I deal with. I went back in January to a therapist. I thought, okay, I'm just going to talk about what I'm going to do with the last 10 years or so of my life. And I get into this, and I'm at my second session with her, and I'm really wanting to talk about how long am I going to be comfortable living in this house and needing to take care of the yard and everything that's involved here. Because I have assisted living between Edwin getting my eggplants and Don taking care of the yard. I am really fine, but without either one of those, I would be I would be having to do more than this 80-year-old gal wants to do. But I'm talking to this gal, and she's trying to figure out what she's going to do with me, I guess. And she said, well, I think you have PTSD. Well, I left there, and I almost immediately had a nosebleed, which is something that I'd been having almost since I decided that I was going to get some counseling. And I don't think that you can just cause yourself to have a nosebleed.
Right.
The air was dry, and we did put a humidifier up. But I started thinking, I know that. I have known that even probably before 35 years ago.
Sure, why wouldn't you?
Lisa was hospitalized after she poisoned my son, who was 3. She put a poisonous plant product into the milk and had him drink it. And that was when she was diagnosed and sent to a mental hospital in New Orleans. And before Mac was killed, his adopted son from his second marriage, who was living with that wife, shot himself with a shotgun in his mother's kitchen. And then Mac was killed.
Wow.
So PTSD is not the trauma itself. We all have trauma, I think, at different level. But it's the effect of trauma has on me, I realize. And nobody ever said this to me. I've had to really figure it out on my own, is that at times I dissociate. At times you can be talking to me and I'm just not here. And there's a little thing in my head that is sort of aware, but I have done that over and over again with different people, and it's ended friendships. Sometimes it's just ended it in ways, without anything. Other times, and in one particular case, this woman wrote me a letter, and it was very hard for me to comprehend at the time, and this is probably 20 years ago. She said, I can no longer be your friend because when I'm with you, I feel rejected. And it was like, how can she feel rejected? I stored her car for 3 years. When she was in Sweden, I found this book of Danish humor for her Danish boyfriend when she was in Sweden. I called Powell's bookstore long distance, but I think it's because there were times when I just would not be there, and the people didn't know to bring me out of that. And I did have a friend who unfortunately died probably 10 years ago now. Nan Simons had been with me once when that happened, and I was very aware that it happened. I was letting her off at her apartment, and I was just like frozen in the car. She was downtown, and she said, Diana, I really like to talk to you. And it brought me back. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Diana, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you. And it's just an honor to know you and spend some time with you. And
what have you gotten out of knowing me?
a whole bunch of, you're an inspiration, Diana. You're an inspiration, all you've been through, and you keep on going, you keep on living. You know so much, and you're just an inspiration.
Well, thank you. I had that job for 23 and a half years. Asked to go on disability after a double mastectomy, and we had our company had been merged with Disney. Michael Eisner said it works better for us to terminate her, and they fired me.
Wow.
Poor Edwin was just becoming a full-time bus driver, and he had to take over everything for us. So, yeah, talk about. And then I had silicone implants, and I had a bad reaction and had to have them out, and I developed Sjogren's syndrome, which is an autoimmune disease. Yeah. And I got a settlement from Dow Corning for that, and used it to visit the family homes of my mother's father and grandfather, which was part of that genealogy story that I didn't get into.
Wow. Wow.
That's more than you can deal with, I think.
Yeah, let's leave it there, Diane. I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you, and thank you for spending some time with me.
Well, thanks for listening. I don't know what you can do with this. It's all over the place. Have some cherries. Can I send some home with you?
I would take some cherries, sure.
Okay.